Good morning, everybody. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to the Army-Navy Club on Farragut Square in downtown Washington, to the 9th annual AGSIW Petro Diplomacy Conference. For all of those in our virtual audience, I want to welcome you, say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. We are very happy to have you joining us for this discussion as well. What I find very interesting is the last big in-person event that AGSIW held was our Petro Diplomacy Conference here in this room in 2019. And that conference had somewhat different content than we're going to hear today. We talked a lot about how oil producers and oil companies and gas companies were going to cope with, in their own business plans, a move toward adapting to climate change, with a couple of glances at the arguments of activists and the people who are arguing for a more quick transition. But a lot has changed in the past 3.5 years, and environmental activism and concern about climate change has become a dominant force in setting the energy agenda for companies, for countries, and consumers. And we seem to be involved seriously in a transition away from high carbon sources of energy to cleaner methods. And this is becoming a business assumption, not just something that is a good idea that activists would like to happen. Hundreds of billions of dollars are flowing into renewable energy, and last year, for the first time, the investment in renewables exceeded investment in traditional hydrocarbons. And increasingly, you see investment in ESG, environment, social, governance issues, driving large investors, and certainly in the United States, President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is likely to throw more money into renewable energy. Now, since we are the Arab Gulf States Institute, we do want to focus today on the Gulf, the producers in the Gulf, the broader Middle East region, but a lot of what we talk about will have implications globally in oil and gas markets and in the adaptation and move toward energy transition. And in the Gulf, a lot is actually happening. Wealthier countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are moving to diversify their own economies. They're trying to address their own risks to increase their climate resilience. And they're investing significant resources to expand their production and use of renewable energies in their own economies and also potentially for export. And even middle-income countries, I think, take Oman as an example, are investing in hydrogen and green hydrogen projects, although without a well-established international market for hydrogen as a source of energy. So over the next 2 days, we are going to try and examine a bunch of fundamental questions about energy transition, energy production, including things such as what is an energy transition and what might it look like? Can major oil producers succeed in reducing the carbon intensity of the energy that they produce? And if so, what might be the best strategies to do that? Will geopolitical shifts in the world, the rise of China, the growing ambitions of regional powers, many of which work in the Middle East, live in the Middle East, will it affect energy markets? Will it create stability or instability going forward? And back here in the Gulf, our home territory, what will the future energy mix for GCC states look like, and what opportunities does that give, and what pitfalls might that entail? But before we move into the discussion, I want to give everybody a little bit of the ground rules of how we're going to do this. We are hybrid. We've got a sizable in-person audience today. We also have a large virtual audience. So in order to move the sessions along a little bit more smartly, we're going to do very quick transitions between our sessions today. So for those of you online, don't go away for too long, because we will change out our speakers and have really quick transitions between sessions. For those of you here in the room, feel free to get up, move around, take a break when you need it, get a cup of coffee. We're not trying to keep you here in the room uncomfortably, but we do want you to come back and join into the discussion as quickly as you can. For those of you here in the room, after our second session, we're going to move downstairs for our lunch keynote session. So I would ask that you move as quickly as you can down the stairs and into the dining room, which is sort of beneath that end of the hallway. Mike Howard and I are going to start relatively early while they are actually serving you lunch, so that we have a little bit more time to expand the discussion, both in person and online. Tomorrow, our final two sessions are going to be completely virtual, so it'll be just like a normal Zoom meeting where you can participate in the normal way. And we'll have an excellent briefing from the IEA and then a concluding session as well. So with all the introductions and ground rules out of the way, I want to dive into our substance, go to our experts and our very knowledgeable attendees, and start our discussion. Our first panel is Decarbonization Pathways in the GCC, and our moderator is Kate Dourian. Kate is an AGSIW non-resident fellow, a contributing editor for the Middle East Economic Survey, and a fellow at the Energy Institute. And if you've not yet read it, the author of the very good scene setter for this conference, which we emailed around to everybody by email, I think, early this morning. If you have not read it, I really recommend that you do, because it does set the stage and address a lot of the questions that we're dealing with. So, Kate, with no further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doug, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whoever's dialing in visually. I'm very, very pleased to have this really excellent panel. I've known our three speakers, and I think you do too, because they are experts in their field. One of the surprising things that while researching the paper, was to see how small the percentage of renewable energy is in the Middle East, excluding North Africa. Actually, Africa has more. The IRENA numbers show that renewable energy capacity in the Middle East, excluding Egypt, Morocco, which are big renewable energy producers, is 1% of the global total. So that's why it made me think about the transition in the GCC countries and how much more it needs to be scaled up if we are going to get these sort of ambitious projects, green hydrogen, green ammonia, more solar. And it just seems to me that there is so much more that needs to be done to decarbonize. And the IEA will tell you tomorrow that they expect peak oil demand to come sooner rather than later. So is that going to accelerate, or is it at the same time as, countries like Saudi Arabia, which Adam knows very well, and the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq are expanding their production capacity? So who's going to get it right? Who's going to end up with stranded assets? It's a very, very complex issue, and I'm not going to talk very much. It's all in the scene setter, but I would like to very briefly introduce, by no order except maybe seniority, Adam Sieminski, who is very well known to you. He's a senior advisor on the Board of Trustees of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center that we know as CAPSARC. I've got Sara, Vakhshouri, who is founder and president of SVP Energy International, and Ben Cahill, who's a senior fellow, Energy Security and Climate Change Program Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, to the rest of you. So I'm going to start by asking Adam, because you've been working with CAPSARC and very closely with the ministry in Saudi Arabia. What is being done to decarbonize the energy sector? Because we have a slightly later net zero target in Saudi Arabia of 2060. And there's a lot of talk about carbon capture storage, circular carbon economy. But where are we at what stage are we with this decarbonization, with this new technology that hasn't really taken off on a large scale yet?
Thank you, Kate, Ambassador. Hello, everybody. Well, Kate, your question is a really interesting one. I spent a long time, almost 5 years, as the administrator at the Energy Information Administration, and then as the president and then advisor to the board of CAPSARC. Both of these institutions are fact-based, or at least try to be. So I like to start with a few facts. And the Energy Information Administration published their outlook for global energy consumption, and it is kind of, I wouldn't say business as usual, but it's based on existing law regulation and not expectations of how laws, regulations, and so on might change. That's what the IEA did in their forecast for net zero by 2050. What they did is they picked an endpoint, and then they worked towards the endpoint. if you look at what the Energy Information said about Energy Information Administration said about the global energy outlook, what they said is oil demand is actually likely to keep growing over the next several decades, despite the fact that renewables are the fastest growing form of energy. There will still be a lot of natural gas and even coal consumption in 2050 under this scenario. So I think that coming back to your question, let me just give you an example. If you think about energy consumption, you've all have heard these statistics. There's 1 billion people that don't have electricity. There's 2 billion people that don't have clean cooking fuel. Those are mostly women and children that suffer from the indoor air pollution problems caused by burning animal waste for fuel and sometimes wood, which leads to deforestation in a lot of areas, right? So on that issue alone, propane is a great solution for cooking, right? But it's a fossil fuel, and we have a lot of people who are saying, well, we should ban fossil fuels, we should eliminate fossil fuels. I think it's a poor framing of the issue. So let me now quickly answer your question. It's not the fuels that need to be decarbonized, in my view. It's the atmosphere that needs to be decarbonized. It's the emissions that we have to deal with. And we could even start with methane emissions, unburned methane, which is a climate problem and is something that hasn't been fully addressed even here in the United States, in places like North Dakota and Texas. And you all know about the other areas, Russia, Nigeria, Iraq, and elsewhere, where methane flaring and simply release to the atmosphere is taking place. So I think that we are still going to have quite a bit of fossil fuel consumption. That's good. I mean, in many ways, it's good. It will help the economy. There are many sectors that are really difficult to decarbonize. Air travel, airlines, for example, heavy heat applications in industry, cement manufacturing, and so on. We can look for technological solutions for these things, but we need to think about this holistically. So, Kate, what we need is to think about the 4 R's of the circular carbon economy: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. And we can't forget about remove. That reduce is like conservation, renewables, efficiency activities. Nuclear should fall into that category. Remove, reduce, and reuse includes a lot of things. Remove, get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, do something with it. You can do that in nature-based solutions, whether it's forestry or mangrove restorations, in the coastal areas, things like this that are a terrific way of doing it, or technologically through direct air capture and then doing something with the carbon dioxide. So what we can't do is fall into this trap of saying that we're going to easily and cheaply eliminate fossil fuels. I don't think that's going to happen. So what we need is an all-out R&D demonstration set of projects across the board for everything, keep everything on the table, try to get this done, and lower the costs of these other technologies. We did it very successfully with electricity, and we did it with wind, and we need to do it in a dozen other technologies that will help us reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you were talking basically about demand-side management, right? I mean, because at the end of the day, you can manage your scope 1 and scope 2, but when it comes to scope 3, it's sort of out of your hands. So you have to, energy efficiency, and my friend Olgu here is looking at energy efficiency in Turkey.
In 15 seconds, I want to come back to the paper that you wrote and the quote you have from Secretary General Gutierrez and his view of that question. And so let's not forget to talk about it.
Okay. No, it is. But I mean, what I really wanted to talk about was, yes, we are going to have oil and gas for decades to come. And even by 2050, even in the more optimistic, net zero targets, there is still going to be some oil and gas, but it has to be decarbonized. And Saudi Arabia talks a lot, and other producers talk about getting rid of methane, as you call it, or as I call it, and storing carbon dioxide, but it's not happening on a large scale at the moment. But I want to move on to Sara, because one of the other interesting little bits of data that I gathered while I was doing my research was Iran has the highest renewables percentage because of hydro. But hydro is on the way down because a lot of numbers actually exclude hydro, but the IRENA numbers don't exclude hydro. So you have a problem with hydropower being an issue. You've got water scarcity in countries like Iraq. So and Iran is under sanctions. If we get sort of partial relief, where does Iran stand in the sort of great scheme of things? Because we're not sure what's going to happen to Russia post-war. Is it going to have the same capacity? What happens to countries like Iran? What happens to countries like Iraq? They're not doing enough on mitigation. They don't have that much renewables except for hydro, which is on the way down. So I'd really love your views on where Iran stands. And if you want to go and expand a bit further, that's fine.
Thanks, Kate and Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. So when we're talking about renewable, that Kate gets the tricky point is is this a capacity that has been built through industry, or is natural resources that the country is using simply like hydro? Yes, Iran has a lot of hydro capacity, but Iran is also dealing with drought and severe water issues. So, I don't have necessary hope that that is going to be expanded, especially now with water issues in Tajikistan and Iran's issue with drought. But something that I like to emphasize is what Adam said. Looking at just in the region that we're talking about, UAE is now hosting COP. UAE is one of the very few countries in the region that has been looking at demand management. So actually, the country has a solid demand management strategy and a document, which I had the privilege of reviewing that. This was before COVID. They have these creative methods of looking at how much demand is produced in the country, in which sectors, how can they efficiently reduce and manage that demand. This is something that has been dropped from the discussion of energy transition. When we are talking about energy transition, decarbonization, our most focus is on how supply should be. How can we produce supply with a cleaner alternative sources of energy? But there is no emphasis on demand. And if we would like to start with the GCC or the Gulf area, I would say that UAE is a perfect example of, because they're building a lot, the country constantly builds buildings. So now they have been looking on a very careful codes for buildings. They produce a lot of water. Adam mentioned clean cooking energy, but also there is a strong nexus between water and energy, and countries in this region often are desalinating water. In Saudi Arabia and UAE, most of the Gulf countries, and how that water, which is a huge amount of electricity involved, is going to be used in in a very efficient way. Coming out of region and looking at it more global, my most concern, which there hasn't been any study, at least as of now, if I know, have been published on how AI and clouds are going to have impact on demand. We have Mark here and Adam also, two major organizations that we were relying on their data. Most of the future forecast on demand are based on two factors, population and economic growth. But now that we're looking at the demand growth for any type of energy for the next, let's say, decades, how can we anticipate how fast the AI and clouds are going to increase and how it's going to have impact on demand? I mean, this is a question maybe you guys can answer, but in most of the forecasts and scenarios that we have for energy 2050, energy 2040, all the forecasts are based on population growth and economic growth, but AI is rapidly increasing. And this is something we are so much worried about, the numbers of the cars that have to switch from gasoline to electric vehicles. No one, there hasn't been a study, at least as I know, that has come up with a methodology to tell us how fast AI and those data centers are growing. You know, we have this psychological, we think that we are putting all those 2,000 pictures every day we are taking on a cloud. It's not cloud, it's electricity. So those data centers, how are they going to have impact on electricity demand, on energy demand? This is something that is missing from discussion. So I think, at least hopefully for this COP that we are heading, and UAE is hosting it, which is very sensitive about demand management, I hope that we are having more serious discussions about the new types of demand and how rapidly they're going to have impact on global energy demand.
Thank you, Sara. Of course, yes, demand management is starting to take hold, because at the end of the day, these are countries that are very impacted by climate change, and desalination is growing, and I suppose you can switch from use of gas. Ben, you've written quite a lot about the GCC countries and the energy scene. So where do you see it heading? I mean, we do have COP28. We do have two countries that are really sort of leading the pack in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Is it enough? Are we on the right track, or what are the gaps?
Well, thanks, Kate. Thanks, Ambassador Suleiman. It's great to be here today. It's a very long, narrow room, so I can't see half of you. I feel like we're at a giant dining table. You can't quite see the other end, but it's really a pleasure to be here. Maybe I can start by just setting out some kind of broad themes in the run-up to COP28 and the role of the GCC states. So all the GCC states, aside from Qatar, as far as I know, have net zero targets. Those net zero targets are by 2050 for the UAE and for Oman, and by 2060 for everyone else. And we're in a special period now in the run-up to COP28, with the UAE holding the COP28 presidency, Sultan Al Jaber holding this role as COP28 president. And there's a lot of scrutiny on the role of the Gulf states in the energy transition and how much they're doing themselves to accelerate that transition, what role they see themselves playing over the long term, what's the role for fossil fuels. As you all know, all these net zero targets are not incompatible with the expansion plans for oil and gas. So in Saudi Arabia, you have a plan to expand oil production capacity, maximum sustainable capacity, as it's called, to 13 million barrels a day by 2027. In the UAE, ADNOC has a target of raising oil production capacity to 5 million barrels a day by 2027. That target was brought forward. Now they're talking about 6 million barrels a day. If you look around the world, these are two of the countries with the largest expansion plans. And yet, this is not incompatible with the Scope 1 and 2 target. So the question is, how can you do both at the same time? And how do you message that? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about this. It's important to note here, I think that, from the Gulf states' perspective, there's really no conflict here. From their perspective, Western policymakers have really lost their way in the long-term thinking about the pace of the energy transition, the need for continued investment in fossil fuels over the long term. From their perspective, the oil is going to be needed, and they have a comparative advantage, obviously. They have large-scale, low-cost, low-carbon intensity resources. So that was why I think the reaction to the IEA net zero scenario was so furious among the Gulf states. And, you saw that the spat between OPEC and the IEA has really gone downhill in the last couple of years. OPEC has stopped using the IEA as a secondary source. Saudi energy minister seems to criticize the IEA at every opportunity. But it's really down to a fundamental debate about what's the role of the Gulf states over that long pathway for fossil fuels. I think the critical question here is how quickly the Gulf states can increase the share of renewable energy in the power sector. Because if you do that, that makes a lot of things possible. And it's important to keep in mind a couple things here. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, in the summer months, you have up to 1 million barrels a day of crude oil burn for power generation, with both crude oil, diesel, and other liquid fuels. I mean, this is enormously wasteful from an economic perspective. That's oil that could be exported for much higher revenue. It's not good environmentally. It's really just a waste of resources. It's a shame that it's taken the kingdom so long to make transition plans to kind of wind down the role of liquids in electricity generation. But it's good that the momentum is happening. It's important to keep in mind here, though, that we have a long way to go. I mean, these are economies that have huge solar potential. Some of them, like Oman, have pretty good wind resources. They obviously have a lot of investment capital. They have a whole array of state investment funds and quasi-state investment funds that have expertise in building big projects. And things happen fast in the Gulf. If you have the political commitment, things can happen really quickly. You just don't have the same kind of red tape in terms of, permitting, local community buy-in, a lot of the obstacles to renewable energy development that we see in Europe and the United States and, even in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, the potential to develop this stuff fast in the Gulf states is huge. And I would say that question about the role of renewables in the power sector is directly related to a big question here, which is what is the role of gas in the Gulf? Because if you can rapidly increase the share of renewable energy in the power sector, that frees up a lot of natural gas for multiple uses. And I think there's a big question about, what is the role of gas over the long term? Will more of that gas be reserved for industrialization, for domestic petrochemicals industries at home? Will it be reserved for blue hydrogen production? Right now you see the Gulf states talking about all these things simultaneously. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is that in the last couple of years, the situation with gas has really changed pretty dramatically in the Gulf. Until recently, this is a region that was really gas short. Aside from Qatar, it was kind of a struggle for self-sufficiency in gas. You had some economies like Kuwait and the UAE that have actually been gas importers on a seasonal basis for quite some time. The UAE has been importing gas from Qatar via the Dolphin pipeline. But in the last 10 years, there's been a big focus on domestic gas exploration and development. It's mostly sour gas and unconventional gas, so it's more expensive, more difficult to develop stuff. But again, if you increase the share of renewables, you free up that gas for a lot of different resources and potential end uses. I want to end on, I think what I hope is kind of a realistic note. The fact is these are pretty energy inefficient economies. And we have a long way to go on this decarbonization journey. If you really want to decarbonize these economies, you have to think about how to decarbonize the power sector, how to reform electricity and fuel subsidies. We saw a lot of progress back in the 2014-2015 period. I think we've kind of taken our foot off the gas with some of the Gulf states and continuing that subsidy reform. And in effect, you're asking citizens to pay more for things that have always been kind of a birthright. So that's always challenging. So just some broad themes to start off the conversation. I'm sure we can talk about hydrogen and lots of other things later on.
I was going to get to that.
Hydrogen's the inevitable topic, right? Someone had to mention it at some point.
Well, I do want to talk about hydrogen because, you've got very opposing views on hydrogen. Saudi Arabia wants to build the biggest green hydrogen plant in the world. And I think they've even got the financing for it, if I'm not mistaken, and an off-taker. So that's interesting. But the other side of the argument is, okay, why are we talking about green hydrogen or green ammonia or blue as an export for export as opposed to using it internally, domestically, producing lower carbon products and exporting them? Because at the end of the day, it's quite a complicated process to produce the green hydrogen. First, you need to scale up your solar, wind capacity, whatever it is, or even small modular nuclear units. I was talking to your friend yesterday, Adam, and she was saying, do you know about purple hydrogen? And I said, is that nuclear? She said, I thought it was pink. So the colors of the colors keep I keep hearing about new colors because we've got green and blue and pink and brown and whatever. Anyway. That's one side of the argument. Are we putting too much stock? I think the IEA did a recent report saying Oman could be one of the biggest producers and exporters of green hydrogen. And they do have, joint ventures with BP and others to produce it. I think Egypt wants to do the same. And, you don't really yet have an aggregated demand picture for hydrogen. It seems to be more bilateral relations. I think the Saudi Arabia's exported blue ammonia to Japan. It's happening, but it seems to be so much waste. If you're going to export ammonia, green ammonia, and then regasified it, and then losses along the way. If you export it as gas, it takes up, more space, that it costs 30% more than LNG. I mean, it just seems to me that if you were to switch to hydrogen domestically, but again, that's the other side of the argument. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just putting it out there. But we also have a sort of shift, a very, very important, and we can't not mention Russia and what the whole crisis in Ukraine has done to the geopolitics of energy. I'm not going to talk about geopolitics of politics and diplomacy, but there seems to be also a lot of interest in Chinese investment in the GCC states, and this sort of move, and the flows are incredible. I mean, I've been looking at the numbers, and we're talking hundreds of millions. And I think my colleague Robert here is the expert on China. I'll bring him in later on. But there is a change. There's been a change in trade flows. There's been a change in sort of alliances and geopolitical alliances. Energy, we've had OPEC Plus, which has sort of survived this relationship that is anchored by Saudi Arabia and Russia, and it sort of seems to have held despite a lot of challenges. And one of the questions that came up, and I think Bloomberg did something about this, basically saying, is Russia really now going to be committed to the OPEC Plus cut, which it hasn't really been. So is there any, Adam, what can you tell us about this sort of geopolitical shift, Saudi Arabia getting closer to China, the relationship with Russia, despite everything else that's happened? They are competing more in the Asian markets, but that somehow doesn't seem to have damaged that relationship, that alliance.
So, Kate, commenting on OPEC geopolitics sounds like a career-terminating move for me. So I think I'll stay away from that. But I did actually want to comment on a couple of things that Sara and Ben talked about. Sara mentioned the use of electricity and artificial intelligence. We do know that Bitcoin has been a huge consumer of electricity. I just did a quick lookup. It's in the United States, Bitcoin is using electricity that's equivalent to the entire diesel fuel consumption of the U.S. railroad fleet. So that's and if you want to do a country comparison, all of the electricity in Norway is being used for Bitcoin. I mean, not if in a comparison. So we know that that's a thing. Sarah's comment also reminded me that air conditioning is a huge consumer in the Gulf region of electricity, and Ben's comment about oil being used in Saudi Arabia in the summertime. That's to power electricity and some water desalination. So there is a goal in Saudi Arabia. It's a stretch goal, 2030, that half of the electricity would be coming from natural gas and half from renewables. I think they will make some progress towards that. The renewables targets are being made more difficult by inflation and the cost of renewables going up. Then a final comment on demand management in Saudi Arabia, and I know elsewhere as in the UAE, there are air conditioner standards, there's lighting standards, there's fuel economy standards for automobiles, all of which are similar to those in the industrialized countries like the United States and Europe and so on. Finally, if you really want to do something about global warming and climate, you have to have producers involved. I mean, this is not going to happen without the active use of the technology and capital that's available in the energy industry. And to that end, President Biden actually created something back in April of 2021 called the Net Zero Producers Forum. The Department of Energy is working on this. It includes Canada, Norway, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States. And they are, jointly they represent about half of global oil and gas consumption, and they're trying very hard to come up with some ideas to actually implement a practical strategy towards net zero, starting with methane, which we talked about. Right, and of course carbon dioxide, and finding ways to deal with that. So I think that the idea that producers are the polluting industries, that quote comes from Secretary General Gutierrez, that need to be somehow banished, it is simply unworkable. It's not a practical way of approaching the problem, and we need to get engineers and financiers involved in this and get going in a serious way.
But in order to do all the things that you said, don't we need a carbon tax? I mean, don't we need to put a price on this carbon? Because without that, I don't think we can get there. Am I wrong? Or
you have to be this is a terminology issue. A price on carbon or a value on carbon makes a lot of sense. Whether a tax is the right way to get a price or a value on carbon is a much longer discussion that we should talk about. I think that trying to find a way to get a value on carbon is going to be critical. Saudis and others in the Gulf, I know the UAE, are interested in doing something that would foster that. And I think that the idea that somehow that the producers in the Gulf region are dragging their feet is just simply wrong. They're actually pushing, in many cases, technological solutions that might actually get us out of the problem.
Yep.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I totally agree, Adam. I think that it's important to give credit to the Gulf states for using power more efficiently and changing building codes and all those things. Those are really important, and the benefits will play out over time, right, as that construction continues. Just to pick up on the theme that Adam mentioned, there's a real effort by the Gulf national oil companies to decarbonize their production. So in the UAE, for example, ADNOC is now buying clean power for offshore facilities. It's renewable energy and also nuclear energy, now that they have nuclear power. You have this effort to decrease methane emissions, which is a theme that we see around the world. It's incredibly important. It's definitely going to be part of the COP28 agenda. Among the Gulf national oil companies, ADNOC has now joined the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, or OGMP 2.0. Qatar Energy has joined this as well. I think this is a really significant stride forward. It's important. The stance of the Gulf national oil companies has always been, look, methane emissions is not a problem here. We've got these huge reservoirs. They're very efficient to produce from. We just don't have the methane leakage. We've got top-class engineering. I don't doubt that that's true, but the data to prove it has been lacking. And so it's really important for national oil companies across the board around the world to step up and make tangible commitments to reducing methane. The fact that some of the Gulf NOCs have now done this, I think, is really encouraging. And, if you have a Scope 1 and Scope 2 target, as ADNOC and as Aramco have, these are the kinds of steps you have to take. These are the things that actually equal declining emissions intensity and methane intensity over time. This is how you meet your interim targets and your long-term targets. And so, I think now we're kind of in a place where the Gulf NOCs are sort of pivoting from trust us to, okay, we're going to give you the data and we're going to prove it, and we're going to make this a more tangible part of our corporate targets. And I think it's actually quite encouraging.
Yeah, and it's something I've always said to there is a messaging problem because the message isn't being heard. And as you said, and as Adam said, there's a lot being done to try to decarbonize, and they're actually doing it. And I remember the energy efficiency drive was started by His Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman years and years ago. Long before we started talking about net zero targets, he was going into shops and sort of getting rid of inefficient air conditioners. So I think it's... But, and I've said it to Aramco, it's unfortunate because they put a lot into research and development. They do have a pilot, carbon capture and storage pilot, which I think is being expanded. But again, I don't think it's big enough. And Adam, I think you mentioned direct air capture. It's still very expensive, which is why I'm saying, you've got to have some carbon tax. I think Abu Dhabi is preparing to launch a sort of a carbon trading platform. which again is one example of how you can integrate within the region, because the region isn't really, they're not going at the same pace.
Keep in mind that 25 years ago, solar panels were considered too expensive to make any progress.
And I think that's what we need. But again, and one of the things that nobody talks about is that, and I think if you talk to the oil companies, yes, they have had to change their strategy. So now you've got, the likes of Shell and Total saying, yeah, we're going to produce oil and gas a bit longer than we anticipated, but we're still sticking to our net zero scenarios, which is fine. As my Feridun Vakhshouri recently said at a conference in Dubai, he said, all these people setting these 2050 net zero targets, they're all going to be dead by then. So, nobody's going to be held accountable if they don't make it. And as you said, he said, it's just a number, and for the Europeans, it's sort of like a religion, this net zero target. So you mentioned propane cooking. Getting rid of oil stoves, oil and gas stoves. I think Germany wants to do that. We set these targets and then we don't reach the targets and we set a higher target. So, I think we have to recognize the fact that this is a transition. It's going to take time, and you're not going to do away with oil and gas overnight. It's still 80% of primary energy demand. I was in London in February for the Energy Institute's, what they now call the Energy, it used to be IP Week, International Petroleum Week, which of course is now a no-no. And while we were there, we were harassed a lot by environmental groups who were sort of trying to glue themselves to the door. And then during the gala dinner, they lit off a smoke bomb. We all had to go out in the cold and, be exposed to chants and screaming. And one of the sessions they decided to come into and start yelling and screaming and saying we're killing the planet and we should be ashamed of ourselves. But it was about sustainable investments. But they didn't really want to hear it. And I think that's where the problem is. There is a lot being done in the GCC. So now it's like, why is the head of an oil company in, president-designate of COP28? Well, you know what? You're not going to do it without these big companies who know how to manage big projects, who know how to, who've got the technology, who've got the know-how, and who have, tried, except that unfortunately, their shareholders don't like the fact that they're not producing oil and gas, or that their share price isn't equal to their peers. So they're having to adapt. The messaging is very wrong. The IEA says net zero by 2050. You don't need to invest in new oil and gas. Well, what about decline? Even in your net zero scenario, you're going to have oil and gas, maybe a smaller market, and it's going to be the so-called advantaged oil and gas that's going to survive. So, Sara, you mentioned the AI and all that, but isn't that something that can be used for demand management as well?
The backbone of energy transition, we call it electrification, and that needs a lot of energy demand. That adds a lot of demand. We need a lot of infrastructure. By the time that in US the target for having everybody has EV, if it's achieved, how much electricity infrastructure we need to build. And then at the end of the day, again, we might not create emission from the car exhaust, but at some point that electricity and production of those cars have created. Actually, Kate, you mentioned something. You quoted that, by 2050, many of these people are not there. We might not reach the target. We just set higher target. I think the danger of that is that even if we don't reach those targets, we create certain changes that we get stuck with them, and that could create harm. Because if we want in the United States, for instance, have every car goes EV, if we want to have all the stoves be electricity, not gas, how much electricity we need, where that electricity comes from, is that coal, gas, nuclear, hydrogen production, that comes from electricity. And some of these parts, first of all of them come from oil, petrochemical. That is going to put a huge demand on oil demand, producing new anything, stove or cars. But something that we forget, we don't talk about it, is the harms, the environmental harms from mining. Again, how much study we have about that? About producing, let's say, wind turbine blade, all those high fiber carbons, we need 2,800 degrees of heat, which we can produce it with electricity. We need fuel for that in industry. So We need fossil fuel to produce wind turbine blades. And then when we want to recycle them, they're highly energy intensive. Do we have enough studies that suggest how much a wind turbine blade or a solar panel produce electricity during its life cycle, and how much electricity we need from the mining period to producing that wind turbine or solar panel, and then decommission them and recycle them? So do we have these studies? And one last thing that is always missing, and I think the GCC countries, especially Saudi and UAE, are have done a lot of work on that, is the energy access. The gap between global north and south that is being creating, the energy access affordability, and all those billion people that don't have access to electricity, because of not having access to electricity, don't have access to safe water. How much work we are doing. There's a lot of investment in ESG, but the S is often missing. There's a lot of investment and talk on how we should produce this energy, how environmental, that's social. Going to Africa, you can't see any of those investments really much rapidly happening. You don't see that. And the other issue that is missing, human rights. We cannot have an energy transition that leaves others behind. One is on the access side. The other side is on the mining. Any rechargeable battery you're using, if it's our mobile or watch, and if it's car, which is going to be bigger, everybody, all the discussions, majority of discussions when it comes to EV, everybody's headache is how many charging stations we have, how much electricity we need. What about the chemistry of the battery? Is there any discussion about how much lithium and cobalt we need? Where that cobalt comes? Majority of cobalt in the world comes from one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And majority of those mines, like every other strategic minerals, are owned or processed by China. And there is this book, I read that, I want everybody to read it, Cobalt Red. It discusses, if you go to Samsung, Tesla, everybody will tell you that their batteries have been supplied from a human right, clean, no kids labor. But all of that cobalt produced, most of it in Congo, is produced by Chinese government, Chinese companies. And those that they witnessed it, there's no human rights on the ground. They sell it to each other. It's like money laundry, human rights laundry. And then at the end, it comes from clean. So I think the question of human rights in terms of mining, emissions in terms of mining, decommissioning all these renewables, access, the gap between global north and south, if this energy is affordable or not, these are all very big questions that we need more studies done before we decide that we want to change or encourage the investment to divest from one field to the other field.
Thank you, Sara. And I was actually going to talk about another kind of access, because yes, you're right. And I think the World Energy Council talks a lot about humanizing the energy transition, which means bringing people into the conversation, which we don't do enough of. But talking about access, one of the things I think the industry has done over and over again over decades is put the cart before the horse. So, for example, we've got in the UK, and I think here in the States as well, we've got wind farms that have no access to the grid, because the grid, we need more investment in the grid. And I don't know if enough is being done. I suppose, in the newer countries that are just developing their energy systems, it's a lot easier than having a grid that is not really geared to handle all these intermittent sources of energy. And I think it's probably time to bring in a roundtable discussion, which I quite like. So if anybody has anything... So do you want to say something about grid access?
Yeah. I wanted, Sara did such a great job on the geopolitics. I want to come back to some data issues again.
I spared you that one.
And I thought the way you were going earlier, you were talking about hydrogen, and I thought you were going to get Ben to talk about hydrogen.
Yeah.
But the colors of hydrogen, it's really convenient. If you say green hydrogen, you kind of have a rough idea what you're talking about. And blue hydrogen, coming from natural gas and what have you. So the problem with that is that you really have to, there has to be measurement associated with this. The real question is not what color is it, but what's the carbon intensity of the hydrogen production. Exactly. And that can be measured. That brings me to a larger issue that I want to say is all of the moves towards reducing methane, reducing carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases need a very robust measurement, reporting, and verification system. If we do not have what they call MRV, this isn't, again, it's not going to work. You have to find a way to be able to measure. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So everybody's talking about managing it, but we need an international agreement on measurement, and this is going to be talked about at COP28 coming up at the end of the year, and I really hope they make some progress on that. So thank you.
Thank you. And we will come to Ben and hydrogen, but something Sara mentioned about, precious metals and rare earth. I think, Mark, we were discussing this at dinner last night, is the new Energy Institute statistical review, the former BP statistical review, is now got, they don't have, they no longer list reserves, proved gas reserves, but they have included, but they've included now metals and cobalt and, all these components. So yes, hydrogen. Is it still hype? I remember being here in this very room several years ago, and people were sort of dismissing. They didn't even want to talk about hydrogen because it was sort of seen as too much hype. It ain't happening. That was maybe 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And so, Ben, are we getting closer to the hydrogen economy?
I mean, there's still way too much hype. We can all agree on that, right? I think the hydrogen bubble is bursting a little bit, and we're starting to get more realistic about what are the actual practical end-use applications of hydrogen. It does make sense for the sectors that Adam mentioned earlier, right? So heavy industry, steel, glass, cement, chemicals, maybe aviation, possibly shipping. That's where it makes sense. For the rest of the applications, fuel cell vehicles, hydrogen trains and buses, forget it. It's just too energy inefficient. You should just electrify those things and not use hydrogen. You waste too much energy in the production, and then the transformation into usable energy at the end doesn't make sense. So that's good that we're having a more realistic conversation about hydrogen. The interesting thing about the long-term development of a hydrogen economy is that you need to develop both the supply and the demand at the same time. And that's a hard thing to do. Robin Mills, who's a non-resident fellow here, I believe, at the Arab Gulf States Institute, has done great work on the Gulf States and hydrogen plans. And he notes a couple things that the Gulf States have in abundance that will be really important for hydrogen production. So they have good solar potential, as I mentioned earlier. In some cases, good wind potential. Really favorable geology for carbon sequestration. That's very important for green hydrogen production. And obviously, they have some gas resources for blue hydrogen production. The challenge on the gas side is that, particularly in the UAE and in some other places, maybe like Kuwait as well, you're talking about unconventional gas, sour gas, offshore gas caps. This is more expensive to develop, complicates the economics a little bit. But the potential is there, clearly, and that's why I think the Gulf states and the governments, the national oil companies, and some other state companies and quasi-state companies like Aqua Power and partners like Air Products are developing blue hydrogen in Saudi Arabia, why ADNOC is looking at this, and why they think they have advantages in exporting hydrogen and ammonia. The economics of transporting hydrogen and ammonia over long distances are still uncertain, to say the least. But the really critical advantage that the Gulf NOCs have is that they have the customer linkages. These companies have been selling to Asia for a long time. They have long-standing relationships with the big utilities and the gas buyers in Japan and South Korea. These are the places that want to increase the use of hydrogen. They want to use hydrogen to co-fire with natural gas and coal in power plants. Hydrogen is a big part of their decarbonization plans. And so having that existing relationship with those companies is actually a huge leg up. It's quite important. And you have to develop this market in a kind of stepwise way. In a way, it's kind of similar to the way that the LNG sector developed over time, where you had point-to-point sales, kind of one-off transactions in the early days between, say, Algeria and Japan, and then it grew over time. Suddenly, as more hydrogen supply materializes and as more people want to buy this stuff, you develop more of a liquid market where not everything is locked up in those long-term contracts. But you have to start somewhere, and you have to start with the foundation. So there, I think the Gulf state NOCs have some advantages.
Hey, Ben, you're reminding me that the UAE and Saudi Arabia both have very solid plans for carbon dioxide hubs that would likely include hydrogen as part of the the mix at the hubs. And Saudi Aramco and the Energy Ministry in Saudi Arabia are committed to having the ability to store 9 million tons of hydrogen by 2027, actually, which is a near-term goal. And I think, Sara, the UAE is doing some things that are very similar.
Yeah, no, it's happening. And I think one of the things that gets lost in all this talk about, oh, yes, an oil-producing country is going to be hosting COP28, but, you know, Masdar is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, investor in renewable energy in the world, not just within the region. Aqua Power is huge. But one of the things that scares me, and this is something we were looking at from the new statistical report, the sort of the Beyond Petroleum reports, statistical review, is the share of coal is still pretty big when you look at it. And nuclear is coming down because a lot of these countries decided suddenly, you know, no more nuclear for us. We'll burn coal, you know, lignite, it's fine. You know, emissions are up. 2022 emissions were on the way up, so not on the way down. So something is wrong. But anyway, but you had something that you wanted to say, Mark, I think, when we were talking.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks to all the panelists. I'm struck
Mark,
by...
do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Mark Finley with the Baker Institute at Rice University, and a former producer of what used to be the BP Statistical Review. I'm struck that carbon capture, utilization, and storage hasn't featured more prominently in the discussion of the Gulf states' strategies here. I mean, the industry in the region and around the world already has a lot of practice at injecting stuff into the ground at a massive scale, you know, both liquids and gases. Is there something that I'm missing about why carbon capture doesn't feature more prominently in the conversation?
Mark, I think some of the countries, major producers like UAE and Saudi, they have it. So they're heavily investing on that, and they think actually it's important for future. I think the countries in Gulf, major producers, and those that they're investing wisely and have wiser strategies, because we might have countries that you mentioned Iran and sanctions, they might not have really any strategies for future, or they can implement it. But those countries that they have actually very, I think, more realistic view of future. So while they're investing on very new technologies like in NEOM, how much they're investing on green hydrogen in Saudi or in UAE, but I think they are having a lot of like realistic view toward CCS and CCUS. And you mentioned like the Ds. That's part of Saudi's strategy. The 4D you wanted to maybe... The R, sorry.
Well, it's capturing carbon. In the UAE, there's a steel plant where they're getting a portion of the carbon dioxide, and they're using that to re-inject into an offshore field. In Saudi Arabia, there are a couple of projects that involve capturing CO2, and there'll be more coming as part of this hub that's going to be done in this industrial city of Jubail. Why we don't talk about it more? I think it's partly a cost issue, cost and technology. 4 years ago, when I was looking at it, everybody said it would cost $700 a ton to remove CO2 by direct air capture. The project in Iceland by Climeworks now has that down to $300 a ton, and they have expectations in their second phase that they'll have it even lower than that. Rick Westerdale might have some thoughts on the numbers. If we can over the next 5 years find a way to get the cost of direct air capture down to about $100 a ton, maybe $125 a ton, it would be by far one of the best ways of dealing with CO2 emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So, can we do it? Well, we knocked the cost of solar and wind down by a factor of 10, and we did that over a period of, a couple of decades with a lot of government assistance for research and development and then policies that provided subsidies for the use of solar that created that demand market. So if we get a combination of government and industry kind of working together, I think, on this in an effort, I think it can be done. And if we, I mean, even under the projections that are being made by the UN itself and others, we have to have direct air capture in 2050. Otherwise, you can't reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I believe that a lot of the countries and companies in the Gulf region are fully committed to the Paris Agreement, and to characterize them as being recalcitrant, I think, is wrong.
Oh, I don't think anybody said that. I just think it's a messaging issue as well. But one of the
Not here.
not here, but I mean, the
it's
message
like,
isn't getting
not
across.
here, but I mean, I hear that all the time, and in speeches at the United Nations and elsewhere, that to me are terribly unproductive. It's just a blaming exercise, not an exercise in how to get the job done.
Because you're talking about 4 to 5 years, but by 2030 we should have reduced our emissions by 40%. I mean, it's not looking realistic. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Rick Westerdale, Energy Futures Initiative. First of all, thank you, Ambassador, and to the Institute here for hosting this important dialogue, and to all the panelists. I'd like to make a couple notes, then finish with a question. First of all, Sara, I think your points are well taken. There was a new news article 2 weeks ago about reaching a tipping point here in Northern Virginia. 70% of online activity comes through our data centers here, and they're already struggling to meet the energy demand. And to look at that, electrification, the various points you made, I would also add to that the transmission lines. We need about 12,000 high voltage transmission towers to be able to support, and that's well over a couple thousand miles of transmission lines. Think of all the steel and other materials that go into it, and the infrastructure just to electrify, here in the U.S. But great points there. Thank you for that. Adam, thank you for your point, and I'm often reminded that net zero does not mean zero emissions. And your points around direct air capture or other means are very important, and I think that's fundamental to this region that we're talking about, and the license to operate, and many of the things, I'll talk about the social license to operate, many of the things you've discussed, Kate, around methane emissions are very important. Ben, I'm going to come to you because this is where my question is, and I have a little bit of a difference of a view in a top-down or a bottom-up on hydrogen demand, but we could debate that all day. What I want to drill into, you made an interesting comment about what is the role of natural gas in the Gulf long-term. And as we build up to COP28, I noticed one of the things that Sultan Al-Jaber, and by the way, he was an excellent choice, and I agree with the panelists in terms of someone who can really make a difference and bring everyone into one conversation. But natural gas is not necessarily making it directly onto the agenda. And I think that's a little bit of a concern I have, certainly in a roundabout way through industrial decarbonization. But I'm curious of your thoughts on that, because that is one area that can really move the needle. And as we're talking about that in the build-up to COP28, I'd really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. It's a good question. So I think one of the eternal debates at COP meetings is language around the phase down of fossil fuels, or the phase down of unabated fossil fuels. This is where the verbiage gets endlessly debated, right? This is where you don't envy a COP president, because they have to herd cats and try to come to consensus on all these things. And unexpected things happen. We saw at the last COP that India was pushing for something that other countries weren't. I think your question about the long-term role of natural gas in the energy transition is a good one. This is where the work that is being done right now between the United States, the EU, and about 20 countries to come up with a framework for, natural gas value chain emissions intensity analysis is really important. So the US, the EU, and 20 other countries have pulled together this working group to look at life cycle emissions associated with natural gas. And the basic idea here is If we join up all these efforts to do the measurement, reporting, and verification that Adam talked about earlier, to understand the emissions intensity of liquefaction and shipping natural gas, you can prove that natural gas has a strong climate case, right? You can prove, without a doubt, that displacing coal and using more gas in power generation will be a climate win. The data have been lacking, and frankly, the more we learn about the methane problem, the more the climate case for natural gas gets undermined. So there is a really significant international effort underway to do that, to join up all the data and the measurement and make it visible, to use the data that's coming from satellites, from aerial surveys, and everything else around the world, and join all this up to understand the emissions footprint of natural gas and to bring it down. I do think this will be on the agenda at COP28. I know that the UAE presidency is really quite excited about engaging national oil companies and big oil and gas producing states on this question. It's in their interest to do it. And I think if we put the pieces together, we can help reduce the emissions intensity of natural gas and secure that role for natural gas in the transition over the long term. I do agree that we need a more realistic dialogue about this. I think we've learned in the last couple of years, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war, that we're going to need gas for a long time. There are certain reasons to build gas infrastructure. The idea in Europe that we're not going to need gas after 2030, after 2035 is misguided. And I think that we're now coming to a more realistic conversation about this. But I do expect this will be on the agenda at the COP. And I think that, frankly, the fact that Sultan Al Jaber is COP28 president and we're hosting it there, this is one of those areas where coming from a so-called petro-state means that you can have a realistic dialogue about these things. And I think the role of fossil fuels in developing countries, this is something that Sara hinted at, I think, it's been very divisive at the last couple COPs. It feels like we're talking past each other. Developed countries are having one conversation about the pace of decarbonization and the pathway. Developing countries feel left behind, like their concerns about energy access aren't being addressed. They feel that it's unfair to deprive them of financing for projects that might involve fossil fuels. If you can make that climate case for natural gas, it makes it a lot easier to unlock financing for those things and have that more realistic conversation.
Sorry, if I may, one question that leads to is also the discussion on loss and damage, which was a big topic, and I'm kind of curious.
Oh, no.
I know, but it's the elephant in the room, right? Sorry to put you on the spot, man.
I wish I had an answer to this. All I can say is it will be a big topic of conversation. It was the thing that almost sank the last COP. They kind of cobbled together an agreement to put together a committee. That's always a warning sign when you put together a committee, right? It was a committee that was supposed to be operationalized with representatives of different regions, different types of economies, to come together and talk about how to capitalize this fund for loss and damage, for resilience and damage due to climate-related incidents. I don't know what's happened with that, but I think it is a big source of frustration among developing countries that the rich world hasn't put up the capital and they haven't put their money where their mouth is. $100 billion was promised a long time ago. It just hasn't materialized. We've got to get serious about the loss and damage fund. So I'm sure that will be one of those divisive issues that Sultan Al Jaber is going to have to deal with. It'll be kind of front and center.
Isn't it one of the problems that some of these countries that are very, very wealthy do not consider themselves to be developed nations and do not want to contribute to a loss and damage fund because they say, hey, and we're not going to name the countries, but Rick, you and I know how much redaction goes into those papers, endless redactions. So I think on the fossil fuel, the role of fossil fuels, which is still not on the agenda as far as I know, in any, in it, which they recently, I think, met in Berlin to discuss the agenda. It didn't make it. And I think that's going to be one where you're going to have very, very creative language in order to get it somewhere in, because otherwise it's going to be considered a failure if they don't tackle the issue of what the role of unabated fossil fuel, or just the fossil fuels. Subsidies, talking about subsidies ain't enough. And coal is easier to talk about, but it's oil and gas. Anybody else have questions for our Olga, please?
Thank you. It's a pleasure of mine to be here today.
It's off. The microphone is off.
Now it's on. Yes, now it's on. Okay. It's a big pleasure and an honor to be in this room today, and I love this coincidence to have a chance to be here. And thank you for your very interesting contributions. Because I'm working on Maghreb, Mashreq countries, including Turkey, energy, but lately much more on climate change issues, energy efficiency projects. And in UAE, it's not a place of the world that I work. And then now I want to take advantage of being here to ask questions based on the experience that I have in the region where I work. In Maghreb, in Mashrek, in Turkey, when we work on the energy efficiency, also in Europe, we use money as weapon, like carbon market, finance. You spend, you pay more. I feel like in the UAE, I'm not sure how it can work, considering the economic situation. No? There are some countries we use the scarcity as a weapon. Like if you don't implement energy efficiency policies, you will just, like your energy access is already limited and you will not have it at all. Let's say Lebanon. Like energy efficiency is a must. It's not an optional, it's not a fancy, it's just like there's no electricity. So we need alternative energy sources, we need to develop energy efficiency policies. When I see UAE, just like sharing my thoughts, I'm not sure if it's, again, a good weapon to use because it's not realistic. It's not conformed to realistic conditions. And then an option that I see is, also an arm that we use to promote energy efficiency policies is identity. Just like being energy efficient, just because it's cool to be. It's the image, it's marketing. This is how it is. And which requires a cooperation with sociologists, psychologists, marketing expert. Like it's something like turning the Masdar not an exceptional place that you visit when you go there, just like interesting thing as a marginal, but as rule, everywhere is a Masdar. So then I'm asking, and I want to take advantage of being in this platform to ask, how is it possible? Is there a room to have a policy, a marketing, and it's like social action about turning to this an identity, energy efficiency, an identity of OEAB? Just a definition of how they are, who they are. And why I ask this question and why I wanted to take this platform, because yes, we are going to COP28, and the ones who have been who had chance to be in Sharm last year, I'm sure we all shared the frustration being in the Sharm and having this not energy efficient COP compared to 26, 25, 24, how they were organized. And so, I want to take this opportunity to ask this question, and maybe thoughts that we're going to be able to raise here will inspire some for the organization of COP28, Thank you.
Anybody want to talk about?
I can make just a couple quick comments, I guess. Curious to see what Adam and Sara think. One interesting dimension of COP28 being held in the region to me will be what kind of investment can you see between the Gulf states and North Africa and the other Middle Eastern countries. There's a real desire to change the way the COPs have been held to give the Gulf states a voice. I do think it's healthy to bring in the voice of oil and gas producing states. But we have to remember that these are huge sources of investment capital, and they can be real engines of renewable energy development. So a couple of weeks ago, Masdar and partners, I think, announced an offshore wind project in Egypt to develop, I believe, 10 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity. I think increasingly people will be looking to Mubadala, ADQ, the Public Investment Fund, Aqua Power as engines of capital to spread across the broader region for renewable energy projects. And I'm sure that in the UAE, there's a strong desire to do those kinds of things. And Sultan Al Jaber's background is, he's someone who's done this. Masdar's had this portfolio of international investments for some time. So we need to think of these countries not just as oil and gas producers, but as holders of capital, people who are very experienced with managing mega projects, people who have done business in different parts of the world, who have a comfort level in the broader region. And they can be real catalysts, I think, for renewable energy development in North Africa and maybe other regions too.
Yep. Having moved back again to Dubai, I can tell you they don't take failure. They don't know the meaning of the word failure, because everything has to be the biggest and the best. So I don't think Sultan Jaber is going to allow it to be a failure. But
and there will be food and water in the tents this
year.
There
will be proper food and water. And no, but one of the things that I noticed, again, looking at the numbers, We talked about the use of crude and liquid fuels for power generation. Of course, the power system in across the Middle East mainly is gas-powered generation. But in the UAE, you can actually see the gas usage has come down because of nuclear. You know, nuclear is going to be providing, 20 or 25% of power demand. So I think, Sara, why are we not seeing more nuclear power in the Middle East, particularly the small modular units that are cheaper? You don't need to invest in a lot of infrastructure. It's, and they can produce, you can use them to produce power, hydrogen, whatever. So I think, Sara, you wanted to talk about nuclear, so please go ahead.
Sure, mostly I wanted to, Kate, also touch on the geopolitics side of it. But yes, I think UAE, especially, and Saudi and UAE, again, we mostly talk about these two countries when we are talking about GCC because these two countries are really the flagships of countries in this region that they have strategies actually for decarbonization and a pathway to energy transformation. Oman has with green hydrogen you mentioned. So I think that, again, going back to both countries, they have plans. They also, not just on the current capacity, but on building further capacities. Something that I think it's very important, going back to geopolitics, Russia war, and one of the consequences of war was that the European Union announcing that nuclear energy now is considered a green energy. So going back to those hydrogen collars, now we think hydrogen might be green hydrogen. But something that we don't consider is that was this a strategy to reduce dependency on Russian gas? But isn't Russia dominating more than 40% of nuclear fuel market and process and uranium mine? So when even here in the United States, when President Biden announced a sanction on Russia on import of any source of energy from Russia, including unfinished gasoline that we really needed in East Coast, no public opinion know that, or maybe they really, I don't say no one knows, but it was not mentioned that import of nuclear fuel from Russia was waived. So until this day that we're talking, United States still imports nuclear fuel from Russia. So Russia could put maybe sanctions on U.S. and then we would have issues with the 20% electricity in U.S. that we're producing from nuclear. And if you want to investigate further, we see that in Utah, the uranium mine that the United States has, Rosatom, Russian nuclear energy agency, has ownership in our uranium production mine through Canadian companies and joint venture they had. So if we look at nuclear because now we have a question of energy transition and energy security. So energy security is like, okay, wake up call. We are all up. We know after Russia war, we all need energy security. But is this something, again, nuclear becoming a major part of our energy production, another trap? Or do we need to study more about that? Because Russia obviously has a huge share on mining and process of fuel currently. And also the other thing that Russia does is offering countries, those development countries that they need funding, that they would give them financial assistance if they want to build nuclear facilities by Russia, Rosatom. So in fact, that European Union's policy that nuclear is green, which was a strategy to reduce dependency on Russian gas, is going to create a huge market and business for Russian nuclear energy, because now everybody wants to invest in green energy. Nuclear is green. So yes, I think Saudi and UAE started to take initiative to be part of the chain of nuclear fuel production, which we need diversification. So we need to, if nuclear is going to be a big part of energy security and energy transition, we would need more countries, especially United States, also to take more initiatives. I know US is very ahead on SMRs, but in a larger scale, nuclear power generations, still we are having dependency on Russia. Thank you, Kay.
Thanks. Yes, you're right. I forgot to mention that, of course, the Russians are building the nuclear power station in Egypt as well. Noam, you had something that you'd like to say. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. Please.
Okay, I have two questions. One question.
Sorry. Identify yourself, please.
No, I'm Raydan. I recently joined the Washington Institute. Previously, I was working in Baghdad and Beirut as an energy reporter and also consultant. I have two questions. One of them, you're going to be happy with the question. It's about Iraq. But let me start with gas. The conversation is very interesting, which makes me ask, when renewable energy fails, what will be the backup fuel? This is the first question. The second question is, there is this, you might call it schism between developing countries and developed countries. And sometimes developed countries sound like they're lecturing developing countries. I'm going to talk a little bit about Iraq. Iraq came out of an invasion and wars not a long time ago, just recently. So how do you expect, a country like Iraq to immediately join energy transition at the time when it's still trying to catch up? That's one. Of course, they won't leave the oil in the ground. Okay, and Iraq continues talking about increasing production capacity up until 7 million barrels per day. Well, this is debatable, right? Because there's the issue of infrastructure, or if they're ready for it. Also, Iraq has a big problem, which is one, corruption, which we all know. Regulatory and technical challenges in order to join the energy transition, right? So when we talk also about energy transition, there's this big problem. How can you join energy transition when you don't have regulations? You don't have the right regulations for that. You don't have the laws. The laws in order to attract investors. And then you have the oil companies in Iraq. They come in and then they add an item, right, on their project saying, okay, we're going to give them solar. But the thing is that the grid is not ready for them. They don't have the laws for that. So there's a question also about the oil companies in Iraq, what they're doing or how they're addressing the problem. Are they only including renewable energy just to tick the box and say, okay, here we go. We have a project in Iraq, so stop telling us to join, to become green. So this is for Kate or whoever would like to answer this question. And gas, the first question, when renewable energy fails.
Yeah, well, they don't have renewable energy at the moment. But again, we're seeing more cross-regional investment. Aqua Power is going to be maybe involved in the Total Energy project, the mega billion Ratawi gas hub in Iraq. And then we're going to have Qatar Energy maybe getting involved as well. They're talking about maybe Aramco coming in to develop the gas. There's no deal yet, but I think we're seeing more of that Gulf Arab investment into Iraq. Now, of course, they do have plans for solar power, the Chinese, the Total, but nothing's moving and they're flaring a lot of gas. So when people say to me, oh, Iraq is an exporter or Kurdistan is an exporter of gas, and I say, why? By the time the gas pipelines are ready to go to Europe, Europe won't want it anymore. It's so much better to use it internally, stop flaring it, and use it domestically. But Ben, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, the New York Times and the BBC have both done terrific video journalism pieces on the flaring issues in Iraq, and it's actually just heartbreaking to see. These flares stay lit all night. There are communities where the cancer rates are through the roof because they're exposed to so many carcinogens. I mean, this is a huge problem. If we want to provide aid and support for countries to get the methane problem under control and deal with flaring, Iraq is just a perfect test case for whether or not it's possible to come up with financing instruments, support, technical capacity, sharing to help the companies in Iraq do this, because otherwise it won't happen. I mean, there have been plans for a long time for companies to go in and develop all the gas that was associated with oil production in Basra in the southern fields, and it just hasn't happened. Technically, commercially, it was too complicated. We need to fix this flaring issue. I mean, it's obviously a human health issue, and it's just terrible for the environment. My colleague, Will Todman at CSIS, has published an excellent report on the role of renewable energy in Iraq and in some of the Levant states, in Lebanon and elsewhere. And the way that he's written about it is that if you're in a country where the grid is poorly maintained, badly managed, state utilities are corrupt, power provision is completely unreliable, which is the case for people in Iraq and Lebanon and elsewhere, distributed energy generation, rooftop solar, those kinds of bottom-up solutions, they're happening because people are just fed up. That's not a solution, though, right? I mean, you can't industrialize based on that. It's not sustainable for the country to rely on that. But this is what's happening, I think, across the region as people just get fed up with kind of badly run power systems. Your other question about the role of gas. So obviously there's a really important role for natural gas in backing up renewables, right? And that's going to exist for a very long time. And I think this is why certain parts of the world are going to have this continued role in providing oil and gas exports to supply that gas that is needed to back up renewable energy. We need a more realistic conversation about this in Europe. I think in the rest of the world, in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, policymakers are quite cognizant of this. It's one of the reasons why they're a little bit wary of moving too quickly to get away from coal and burn more gas in power generation. It's expensive, but it's one of the reasons that's holding back renewable energy development a little bit, because from a policymaking standpoint, a grid management standpoint, if you want to rapidly increase the share of renewables, you have to think about firm baseload power generation and where you're going to get that from. And so getting that from imported gas is quite expensive and complicated. But I agree with you that, it's time for a more realistic conversation about how long we're going to need gas and in how many countries, even as we grow the share of renewables, because as that backup fuel, it's quite important.
Hey, Ben, you mentioned hydrogen earlier. It's possible that hydrogen might be an interesting solution for backing up renewable power when you have when it's not available. You could have failures, where something really goes wrong, but there are going to be times where the wind isn't blowing, sun isn't shining, and so on, and it's just not available. The easiest and best thing to do is to have a robust grid so that you can rely on the grid. But Rick Westerdale, EFI Secretary Ernie Moniz, when I was at the Department of Energy back in 2015, one of the biggest headaches that he had back then, I can remember him talking about it, was trying to implement the Energy Department's authority to have corridors for electricity to move. And, Texas is suffering from that problem now. You could have gas, you could have coal, you could have nuclear as a base load. All of these, have their own set of problems. Utility scale storage, so batteries as could be an option. And I want to come back to something that everybody up here has mentioned. If we're going to do all these things, if there's going to be battery backup for renewable power, we really, really need life cycle analysis. The measurement, reporting, and verification of these things. Sara talked about the minerals. It's one thing I'm absolutely convinced of after a very long career here in Washington, Wall Street, is there is no perfect fuel out there. Every fuel has its own unique set of issues that need to be managed, and we just have to do that. But we are not going to do it very well if we can't measure it.
You're right. I remember once trying to get, I was at the airport and I was trying to use my phone, my electronic boarding pass, I think it was Cairo even, and it wasn't working. And I needed my paper. That was my base load, right? So you do away with that and, you're kind of stuck, you can't get on. But I think, I think Iraq is one of the big issues. I think it's the third biggest flarer in the world. So Russia, Iran is big as well. But they also put the cart before the horse the cart before the horse, because they invested so much in upstream oil capacity. The first round contracts didn't have any provision for the companies to deal with the gas, with the associated gas, so it's being flared, still being flared. Other projects have been delayed for various reasons. I'm sure you know a lot better than that. But, so you import from Iran, you flare the gas that you're producing because you don't have the infrastructure. You produce more oil, but you don't have the capacity to export more because your infrastructure ports, your pipelines are leaking. So I think it's, it is a very difficult situation. Of course, we had no budget in 2022, so the whole thing is being compounded and as you said, corruption and so on. But in the meantime, I think the grid is also not very healthy. it's a lot of leakage, and as we said, we need a lot more grid infrastructure, and I don't think they're spending enough to be able to accommodate intermittent supplies when they come. And the whole hope now is that Total, when people say to me, America went into Iraq because they want the oil, and I said, show me what America has of Iraq's oil. China has a monopoly now over nearly all the major fields. BP's still there, but isn't really. It's sort of there, another name. So I think it's a fallacy to say that. One of the things I want to mention, I've been told I can go over because this is such an interesting conversation that we're having, that as we transition, I mean, I looked... You
might want to take a vote on that.
No. No. One final thing, which I think we can't ignore, and I was listening to an Emirates MBD bank presentation, which showed that the GCC states are still very, very heavily reliant, varying degrees, they're very heavily reliant on revenues from oil and gas exports. How do you transition without upsetting your economic systems, which are still very, very much reliant on, maybe not so much in the UAE because they've diversified more, but it is still quite a high percentage. As you transition, you're not going to get the same kind of rents. It's going to take time to develop these new export sources. So how do you maintain social stability as you transition?
Well, you keep producing oil and gas for a long time. This is a very gradual transition. And the fact is, if you look around the world at all the oil and gas producers, these will be some of the most resilient countries over the long term. So it's not an overnight change, but it is a challenge, right? Nothing is going to compare with the rents that accrue from oil and gas. It's such a huge share of government revenues, export revenues for countries like Saudi Arabia in particular, less so in the UAE because the economy is much more diversified. But the world is changing, right? These Gulf NOCs and the governments, they have to adapt to a changing world, changing customer demands, more demands for lower carbon fuels. And I think they've also kind of woken up to the economic opportunity of renewable energy at home. And again, I mentioned this is not incompatible with their net zero targets. You can free up a lot for export and supply that oil and gas that the world will continue to need for a long time. And the Gulf ministers have been saying for some time now the world is underinvesting in oil and gas. Well, there's a natural role for them in being that resilient long-term source of supply. But Kate, you're totally correct that replacing the rents from oil and gas is just not going to be possible. These industries won't deliver that. It has to go part and parcel with a broader economic diversification agenda. Jean-Francois Sesnek is here. He's the guy who's written about industrialization in the Gulf for a long time, the role of the petrochemicals industry. He's been thinking about these issues. There have been priorities for the Gulf states for a while, but it's been fairly slow progress, right? We talk about hydrogen as an export commodity, ammonia as an export commodity. What about keeping it at home for domestic industrial use, right? This is what Vision 2030 is all about. It's what the sort of competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Oman, to a lesser extent, and others is all about. They all have economic diversification programs. They all want to bring in these industries. They all want to take advantage of some of the natural advantages that they have. And so it's not about, flipping a switch. It's about developing that long-term pathway to reduce the dependence of oil and gas over decades.
Thank you. Yes, somebody mentioned aviation, sustainable aviation fuel. I used to live in Paris, so I have a thingy with Air France and, a loyalty program. And they sent me an email the other day saying that from now on, they commit to using 1% sustainable aviation fuel on their flights. It's like 1%, and that's supposed to get me really excited that you're actually, So I think that's another big challenge, but maybe aviation gets a bad rap because it's 3% of global emissions, or it ain't that much, but it does have a bad reputation. So
It's
Sara,
actually, Master City, they have this project on clean aviation, and they were trying to produce fuel from Salicornia seeds, and they had the first plane that flew to Europe using that. But not only is the issue of jet engines that needs fuel technology, all of that, but also food issue, like many of these alternative fuels that we are looking, even if it's just solar farms, we have to also take into consideration those miles that we are agriculture going to be sacrificed, or if it's the source of food that is going to be fuel, if it's ethanol or Salicornia seeds. So there's a lot of things to, as you said, need to be life cycle analysis. We need to look at everything, and there's not enough. I think we are speaking and setting policies faster than we know the consequences and doing studies, and that sometimes sounds concerning.
Okay, final chance. I was told I can go over 5-10 minutes, so we've got a couple of minutes
Hi,
left. Yes, please go ahead.
From Department of State. So I think this is more of a rhetorical question. So I think Sara and then Rick, they touched on it very well in terms of the energy needs of AI. But quite frankly, yeah, how much more energy are we going to need for cyberspace? Because we got Bitcoin, but the cloud, it's the cloud, but it operates off of servers, all this equipment that also requires energy and to be cooled at a certain temperature. So if anybody has the answer today on what the energy requirements are for AI once it's a robust industry, because I'm thinking, I never imagined I remember, before we had the iPhone, but now I can't imagine being without it. I think AI is going to have the same impact.
Battery life is getting shorter and shorter because we have so many apps.
So this is an emerging field that the Department of Defense is working on, but I'm talking to Dustin Hoffman, photonics. So the issue is you've got the energy to push the signal through copper or gallium arsenide, gallium nitride, and then you've got the requirements for cooling, and you have vulnerability to solar flaring or electromagnetic pulse in time of war. Department of Defense has set up a laboratory in Rochester that is looking at having the chips, instead of the energy being converted to electricity, it's converted to light, which is about 10% of the fraction for the energy and 0% of the coolant. Department of Defense is doing this because it's invulnerable to solar flaring or to electromagnetic pulse. But inshallah, if the technology proves itself, and there's no reason why it can't, because we've already converted, for example, our landline telephone system to visual, photonics has the potential to cut into this, but it's still early days. And once my research is complete, I will write a paper for the AGSIW on it.
But I think one of the big challenges is in terms of energy demand management, forecasting, that's going to be a real big challenge, because it's just like the advent of the fax machine, the advent of cell phones and iPhones. It creates new economies. And what are we going to see? What are the new economies, new businesses we'll see from AI, and what demands will they put on global energy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to have to stop it here, and we've gone over our time. Unless somebody really wants to have a final word. Okay, we can talk. We can talk outside. We can network. I want to finish off by thanking my wonderful panelist speakers, Adam Sieminski, Sara Vakhshouri, and Ben Cahill, and all of you for being here today. So, thank you.